April 18, 1943. Over the Ruhr. The stamping presses shook the ground. Sparks fell like orange snow as molten metal hit the cold concrete floor. On the assembly line, the workers moved in rhythm, women with bandanas, men with grease up to their elbows, assembling a new kind of machine under lights that burned through the night. They called it the Liberty Engine. But outside America, the laughter had already begun. Outside, the air smelled of oil and rain. Freight cars groaned in the distance, loaded with steel bound for new plants rising across the Midwest. Detroit was no longer only a city of automobiles. It had become a foundry of war. Every street echoed with motion. Every face carried the quiet strain of purpose. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood it. The outcome of the war would depend not on generals, but on men and women standing at these lines, holding wrenches instead of rifles. At the far end of the plant, engineers gathered around a test stand. The Liberty engine roared to life, a deafening growl that rolled through the factory walls. The noise shook the windows and made dust fall from the rafters. Workers paused and turned to listen. That sound, mechanical, defiant, alive, was the beginning of something new. It was the first note in a symphony that would echo across oceans. To the Germans, it was still a joke. In Berlin, propaganda films mocked American production. They showed images of women fumbling with tools, of factory hands smoking cigarettes beside unfinished wings. Mass production without mastery, the narrator sneered. The Reich's engineers believed craftsmanship, not quantity, would win wars. Their aircraft were built by artisans, tested by experts, flown by aces. The Americans, they said, were trying to build victory on an assembly line. But that was exactly the point. Henry Ford had dreamed of this scale for decades. The man who once built a car every 90 minutes now promised a bomber every hour. His engineers called it madness. The government called it impossible. Ford, 78 years old and still convinced that machinery could outthink men, refused to yield. He envisioned a factory unlike anything the world had seen, a self-contained city of metal and motion that would turn raw materials into flight. Construction began on a stretch of farmland west of Detroit. It was called Willow Run. To build it, they leveled acres of earth, poured concrete by the mile, and raised a structure so vast that its roofline curved with the shape of the earth. Inside, sunlight poured through glass walls onto endless conveyors. What rolled across those belts would not be cars, but bombers, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, one of the most complex aircraft ever designed. Every worker knew the stakes. Newspapers printed maps showing the advance of German forces across Europe, the fall of France, the bombing of London. The Luftwaffe still owned the skies. American factories were racing against an enemy that already believed itself unstoppable. In cafes and theaters across Germany, propaganda films laughed at the assembly line warriors, certain that a nation of mechanics could never outbuild an empire of soldiers. In Detroit, no one laughed. The 12-hour shifts blurred into one another. The clang of steel never stopped. Sparks painted the night sky above the Rouge River. Beneath the music of machinery lay exhaustion, sacrifice, and quiet determination. Families lived by factory whistles. Mothers tucked their children in at dawn after the night shift. Fathers returned home with metal dust on their skin and calluses that never healed. Each week, the lines grew faster. Engines rolled out by the dozens, each one destined for a bomber that had not yet been assembled. Mechanics tested them under lights that never dimmed. The roar of each engine was both a warning and a promise. America was coming, not with a single blade or bullet, but with the full weight of its industry. The Germans could not yet see it, but the war had already begun to tilt. In the rhythmic beat of stamping presses, and the glow of molten steel, a new kind of power was taking shape. It was impersonal, relentless, and precise. It did not fight with emotion, but with production schedules. By the time the first bomber lifted from Willow Run's runway, the laughter across the Atlantic had begun to fade, replaced by a distant, growing sound. The sound of engines, thousands of them. In Berlin, reels of news film flickered across theater screens. German narrators mocked American factories, showing rows of workers fumbling with rivet guns. Industrial chaos, they called it. The Americans can build cars, not weapons. The crowd laughed. They had no idea that every laugh was an echo that would return to them in thunder. The year was 1942. Across Europe, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. The Wehrmacht controlled the continent from the French coast to the gates of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe still reigned over the skies, and in every occupied capital, banners of the Reich hung from rooftops like iron shadows. Inside the dark theaters of Berlin, laughter became a ritual. Confidence was no longer pride. It was survival. The idea that the Americans could outbuild the Reich was not only dismissed, it was inconceivable. Joseph Goebbels, master of the moving image, understood the psychology of triumph. His propaganda did not need to lie completely. It only needed to exaggerate. In smoky projection rooms, editors stitched together frames that mocked American ambition. The film cut from clean German assembly halls to chaotic American newsreels filled with sparks and shouting foremen. "They play jazz," the narrator sneered over the images. "We build destiny." The audience roared, not from amusement, but from relief. Yet, behind the curtain of laughter, the numbers were already shifting. In a single year, American industry had produced more aircraft than Germany could hope to build before 1945. The shipyards of California and Virginia were launching new vessels every few days. In Detroit, Ford was building a factory larger than any in Europe. Its purpose was simple and terrifying: to turn raw steel into flight. The Germans refused to believe it. In their eyes, machines built by civilians could never equal those crafted by artisans. They saw factories as symbols of weakness, not power. They trusted craftsmanship, precision, and heritage. But America trusted something different: the repetition, efficiency, and speed. Each mistake on the production line became a lesson passed from one plant to another, improving thousands of machines at once. While the propaganda mocked the workers, the Americans learned faster than any enemy expected. The same improvisation that Berlin dismissed as disorder became the secret weapon of the arsenal of democracy. Assembly foremen modified tools on the fly. Engineers redesigned entire components overnight. The factory floor itself became a battlefield where adaptation replaced fear. In Berlin, Goebbels' staff began to notice a strange trend. Reports from the front no longer matched the narrative. German pilots who once mocked the lumbering American bombers were now describing swarms of them that seemed endless. The Luftwaffe could destroy 10 in a day, but new ones arrived by the end of the week. The propaganda reels continued to play, but the laughter no longer sounded convincing. Meanwhile, in the American Midwest, those same newsreels reached factory workers through captured broadcasts and reprinted stills. They did not anger them. They focused them. "Let them laugh," one woman wrote in a letter home. "We are building their silence." Each rivet she drove became a quiet response to the voices that had mocked her. By the middle of 1943, the truth was becoming visible even to the most loyal German citizens. The skies that had once belonged to the Reich now trembled with distant engines. The rhythm of those bombers was not random. It was the same rhythm that had once echoed through Detroit, Chicago, and Buffalo, the rhythm of industry at full power. Goebbels tried to drown the fear with new films. The tone shifted from arrogance to desperation. Each reel urged the people to endure, to trust in German genius. But even as the lights dimmed in the theaters, the air raid sirens began to wail. Viewers filed out into the streets to see what had become of their confidence. The night sky glowed red over the city, lit by the very machines they had called impossible. For the Americans, there was no triumph in it, only inevitability. What began as laughter in Berlin had become thunder above it. The same reels that once mocked the United States now served as memories of denial. Every taunt had been answered, not with words, but with the steady hum of engines built by hands the enemy had refused to respect. Confidence, once Germany's greatest illusion, became its downfall. Skill could not defeat scale. Pride could not outlast production. And when the bombers finally reached Berlin, the echoes of that laughter disappeared beneath the roar of 1,000 engines, each one carrying the sound of a nation that had turned mockery into power, and power into victory. By the summer of 1942, Detroit had become something no one had ever seen, a city turned into a weapon. Automobile plants retooled overnight, their conveyors now carrying wing spars and fuselage sections instead of chrome bumpers. Ford's Willow Run facility stood at the center of it all, a machine designed to build machines, a mile long, pulsing, relentless. From the air, it looked like a living thing, a vast body of steel and glass, arteries of conveyor belts feeding into its heart. Trains entered at one end loaded with aluminum, copper, and rubber, and emerged from the other with bombers that glistened in the morning light. The plant never slept. Its windows burned through the night like a second city beneath the stars. The rhythm of industry had replaced the sound of music. Even the streets outside seemed to vibrate with the deep mechanical heartbeat of production. Inside, the air was thick with heat and noise. Sparks floated like fireflies between welding stations. The smell of machine oil mixed with the sweetness of coolant. The workers moved in a practiced flow, passing parts from one to another without pause or waste. They were not soldiers, but the work demanded the same discipline. They wore goggles instead of helmets, carried rivet guns instead of rifles, and fought fatigue instead of fear. In the early days, chaos had ruled. Managers argued, tools broke, deliveries missed their marks. An aircraft was not a car, and the old logic of the assembly line struggled to keep up with the precision of flight. But America learned quickly. Engineers from across the nation arrived at Willow Run to study, redesign, and improve. Mistakes were logged, corrected, and transformed into new procedures. Within weeks, the factory was no longer an experiment. It was an engine of war. Henry Ford's vision had become reality. The man who once built cars for the masses was now building aircraft for survival. He saw production not as a craft, but as a philosophy. Each motion counted. Each second mattered. The plant became a living testament to the idea that speed could be strategy. Ford's son, Edsel, oversaw the operation with quiet determination, often walking the factory floor at dawn, clipboard in hand, studying every movement like a general inspecting the front lines. Outside the factory walls, Detroit was changing too. The city's population swelled as workers arrived from every corner of America. Families lived in small rooms near the plants drawn by the promise of steady pay and patriotic purpose. Cafes filled before sunrise. Bus lines ran through the night. The war had given the city a new identity. Detroit was no longer the Motor City. It was the arsenal of democracy. Across the ocean, German intelligence began to take notice. Aerial photographs revealed something that defied logic. The United States had built an aircraft plant larger than the Luftwaffe's entire production complex. Reports sent to Berlin were dismissed at first as exaggerations. No one believed that a nation so new to war could outbuild an empire forged in conflict. But by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Inside Willow Run, the scale was almost impossible to grasp. Conveyor lines stretched beyond sight. Cranes lifted entire wings into position. Thousands of workers moved like clockwork, guided by bells that marked the changing shifts. At the end of each line, bombers stood in formation, their olive drab skins polished, their engines ready for flight. Every completed aircraft meant another step toward the victory. Each week, production increased. The early goal of 1 bomber a day became 10, then 20, then 60. The process itself evolved. The workers grew faster, more confident, more precise. They sang as they worked, songs carried over the drone of machinery and the hiss of air compressors. It was hard, exhausting labor, but every man and woman there knew that each rivet mattered. Every piece of metal assembled in Detroit meant fewer American lives lost overseas. By the end of 1942, Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a symbol, a reminder that America's strength did not lie in conquest but in creation. Where others destroyed, this city built. Where others relied on fear, it relied on resolve. The arsenal of democracy was awake, and its heartbeat echoed across the Atlantic. Soon, the sound of those engines would be heard in the skies over Europe, carried by the bombers born in this city of fire and steel. The laughter that once filled the theaters of Berlin was fading into silence, replaced by something that could no longer be ignored: the sound of America, building its way to victory. Willow Run was Henry Ford's ultimate experiment. 1 bomber every hour. That was the promise. To achieve it, Ford engineers rewrote industrial logic. Interchangeable subassemblies, moving jigs, synchronized tooling. Each B-24 Liberator emerged not from craftsmanship, but choreography, a mechanical ballet of men and metal. It was a dream that bordered on madness. Never before had anyone attempted to mass-produce a machine as complex as a 4-engine bomber. The B-24 was a flying fortress of more than 100,000 individual parts. It required delicate precision, the balance of wings measured in fractions of inches, and systems that could withstand the thin air of 30,000 feet. Yet Ford insisted it could be built like a Model T. He believed that repetition, not artistry, would win the war. The early months were chaos. Engineers argued over drawings that changed faster than they could be printed. Mechanics trained on mock sections that barely resembled the final aircraft. Deliveries of aluminum were delayed by snow and strikes. Workers grew frustrated, and entire days passed with nothing but the clang of empty conveyors. A single bomber took weeks to complete, but slowly, method replaced confusion. Each problem became a note in an evolving design, and by the end of 1942, the system began to hum with purpose. Ford's philosophy was simple: break the impossible into smaller pieces, then teach ordinary people to build them perfectly. Every component had its station, every motion its timing. The plant floor stretched farther than the eye could see, divided into zones where men and women repeated the same movements thousands of times a day. At first glance it looked mechanical, even soulless, but within that repetition lay a kind of devotion. Each rivet was a heartbeat. Each bolt was a small act of defiance against an enemy that believed democracy was weak. Visitors who entered Willow Run for the first time often fell silent. The building was longer than a mile, vast enough to have its own weather. Clouds of welding smoke hung beneath the roof beams. Overhead cranes carried wings the size of houses, their shadows sliding across the floor like ships passing through fog. Loudspeakers carried the rhythm of instructions, the voice of supervisors guiding the unseen orchestra of production. At the far end of the line, completed bombers rolled forward under their own power, engines coughing to life for the first time. The choreography was relentless. Sections of fuselage moved on rolling platforms, aligning precisely with tail assemblies measured by the thickness of a fingernail. The timing was exact, each motion synchronized with the next, each worker part of a pattern so vast it seemed alive. Engineers called it flow production, but the workers had their own word for it. They called it the river. It never stopped moving, day or night, carrying with it the effort of a nation. Henry Ford visited often, walking the floor with his cane, tapping against the concrete. He watched as bombers took shape and nodded in quiet approval. He saw not just airplanes, but proof of a belief he had carried all his life, that machines could multiply human will. He had once built mobility for the masses. Now he was building survival for the free world. Perfection is not a matter of genius, he told an engineer. It is a matter of practice. As the process matured, efficiency became its own kind of weapon. Raw materials entered the plant at dawn, and by the following day, a finished bomber stood ready on the tarmac. Crews from the Army Air Forces waited outside, watching as their aircraft rolled into the sunlight, its silver skin still warm from the hands that built it. They called it the Liberator, but to the men and women inside the factory, it was simply the product of order triumphing over fear. By early 1944, Willow Run had achieved the impossible. One completed B-24 every 60 minutes, a tempo faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. German intelligence officers who studied the numbers refused to believe them. To their minds, it was industrial fiction. But the truth was undeniable. The Americans had turned production into strategy, and time itself had become their ally. Every hour, a new shadow rose into the sky from the fields of Michigan, bound for the other side of the world. Every hour, the equation of war shifted slightly in favor of the Allies. What had begun as an experiment in manufacturing had become something larger, a new way of waging war. The blueprints that covered Ford's drafting tables were not drawings of weapons alone. They were diagrams of inevitability. Germany still believed in craftsmanship. America had discovered something far more dangerous, perfection through repetition. And with every passing hour, the blueprint came to life. One bomber after another, steady as a clock, relentless as the tide. The factory no longer just built machines, it built the future. Even inside the War Department, few believed it was possible. A bomber is not an automobile, they said. It is too complex. The skeptics had a point. Each B-24 contained more than 250,000 parts, 10 miles of wiring, and systems that had to work perfectly at 30,000 feet. But Ford's answer was simple. Break it down, build it fast, make it fly. In 1942, the B-24 Liberator was considered one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. It could carry 5 tons of bombs, climb higher than any previous American bomber, and stay aloft for more than 2,000 miles. But it was also an engineer's nightmare. Its structure relied on precision fit panels, oxygen lines, hydraulic circuits, and electrical systems that left no room for error. Building one by hand required skilled technicians, and even then, construction took weeks. The idea that such a machine could roll off an assembly line like a family car was seen as absurd. When Henry Ford announced his plan to mass-produce the B-24 at Willow Run, the reactions ranged from polite disbelief to open ridicule. "You cannot teach a riveter to build an airplane in 6 weeks," one general said. "You will get coffins, not bombers." The Army Air Forces sent inspectors to monitor progress, expecting to record failure. They found confusion, noise, and a sea of untested workers. But what they did not see was the foundation of a miracle taking shape beneath the chaos. Ford's engineers refused to accept defeat. They dissected the bomber into hundreds of sub-assemblies, assigning each to its own production line. One section built the nose, another the wings, another the tail. Each team became an expert in its task. Parts arrived by rail from across the country, coordinated through a schedule that operated like clockwork. Every piece was labeled, measured, and fitted into place with mathematical precision. Training was relentless. Mechanics who had once repaired farm tractors now learned to calibrate altimeters. Women who had never seen an airplane wing learned to rivet pressure joints capable of withstanding freezing air at the edge of the atmosphere. Mistakes were recorded, corrected, and never repeated. Within months, the so-called amateurs of Willow Run had become specialists. They spoke in the language of torque, pressure, and tolerance. The skeptics returned in the winter of 1943 expecting disaster. Instead, they found order. Rows of gleaming fuselages stretched across the factory floor, each in a different stage of completion. Conveyors moved steadily. Welding sparks glowed like stars above the workers' heads. At the far end, test pilots ran engines that roared loud enough to shake the windows. The inspectors stood in silence as one of the newly built bombers rolled toward the hangar doors, sunlight glinting off its wings. It rose into the sky and circled back in a perfect climb. It had flown flawlessly. Ford's methods were not elegant, but they worked. Where aircraft builders once relied on artisans, Ford relied on process. Where others sought perfection through craftsmanship, he sought it through discipline. His genius was not in invention, but in organization. Every failure became data, every success a standard. The result was something the skeptics could not argue with: production. By the middle of 1943, Willow Run was turning out more aircraft in a week than some European factories could in a year. Each bomber represented not just a machine, but an idea made real. That complexity could be conquered by order. That precision could be achieved by ordinary hands guided by extraordinary planning. The doubters within the War Department soon changed their tune. Reports that once questioned Ford's approach now praised it as revolutionary. The United States Army Air Forces sent delegations from across the nation to study the system. The same generals who had mocked the plan now called it indispensable. To the workers, none of that mattered. They were too busy keeping pace with the conveyor lines that never stopped. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, they built under the constant pressure of expectation. Coffee replaced sleep. The roar of engines drowned out doubt. By the end of that year, the skeptics were gone. The results spoke louder than any argument. Ford had done what the experts said could not be done. The impossible had been reduced to repetition. From the outside, Willow Run looked like any other factory. Inside, it was something else entirely. It was the place where disbelief turned into faith, where chaos became order, and where ordinary Americans proved that precision did not belong only to scientists or engineers. It could belong to anyone willing to learn. Every hour, as another B-24 lifted from the runway, the noise reverberated far beyond Michigan. It reached Washington, London, and eventually Berlin. For every skeptic silenced, a new believer was born. What had started as an experiment was now a doctrine of production as power. Ford had shown that the future of war would not be written by those who doubted what could be built, but by those who dared to build it faster. The skeptics had lost. The factory had spoken, and its voice was made of thunder. January 1943. The first test fuselage rolled from the line, painted in unmarked silver. Reporters watched through glass as engines roared on the test stand outside. Within weeks, Willow Run was turning farmland into flight. The first of thousands of bombers took to the sky from a runway carved out of Michigan clay. The moment was both mechanical and sacred. The roar of the engines drowned every doubt that had haunted the project for months. In that sound was vindication, not only for Henry Ford, but for every man and woman who had labored through sleepless nights and endless shifts, trusting in a dream that many had called madness. The great experiment had taken form. It was alive. Outside the hangar, the January air was sharp and clear. Frost clung to the edges of the runway as the silver aircraft began to move. Workers gathered along the fence line, their breath rising in clouds against the cold. For most of them, it was the first time they had seen the complete machine. Until that moment, they had known only their own small part. A section of a wing, a string of wires, a handful of rivets. Now it stood before them whole, shimmering in the pale morning sun. When the bomber lifted from the earth, a cheer rose that echoed through the frozen fields. The success of that first flight transformed everything. What had begun as an uncertain gamble now became the rhythm of a nation at work. Each day brought refinement, improvement, and greater speed. The factory stretched farther, the lines grew longer, and new faces appeared with every sunrise. Trains unloaded supplies from every corner of America. Entire families relocated to the countryside of Ypsilanti, drawn by the promise of wages and the chance to serve the war effort without leaving home. The farmland that once fed crops now fed an army of production. Inside Willow Run, the scene bordered on the unreal. The plant covered more than 3 million square feet of floor space, vast enough that the curvature of the earth could be measured along its length. The ceiling disappeared into haze. Cranes glided silently overhead, carrying wings and engines like mechanical birds through an artificial sky. Beneath them, the workers moved in an endless current, assembling the parts of an aircraft that would soon climb into the real one. The process was as elegant as it was demanding. Each station performed a single precise task, repeated hundreds of times each day. Mechanics tightened bolts to exact torque settings. Electricians wove bundles of cable through narrow passages. Painters sprayed the olive finish that gave the bomber its final skin. The work required attention, discipline, and an understanding that perfection meant survival. There was no margin for error at 30,000 feet. When the aircraft reached the end of the line, it was pulled toward the open doors that faced the airfield. There, test pilots waited with their flight gear and clipboards. Engines were started one by one, the thunder rolling through the building until the glass trembled. The pilots taxied onto the field, throttled forward, and lifted away into the cold winter sky. The crowd below always watched in silence until the bomber became a speck of light against the sun. Then, as it banked and turned back toward the runway, applause filled the air. The local towns learned to live by the rhythm of those takeoffs. Farmers would pause their work to watch the great silver shapes pass overhead. Children pressed their faces to the windows of schoolhouses as the bombers climbed eastward toward the clouds. Each one represented more than metal and fuel. It represented the effort of a nation that believed in its own ability to build the impossible. By the end of that winter, Willow Run had become something larger than a factory. It was a living organism of steel and spirit. The night shifts glowed beneath rows of lamps that burned without pause. Workers moved like shadows between machines, their faces lit by sparks and the reflection of molten welds. Coffee replaced sleep. The hum of machinery replaced silence. And through it all the factory breathed, steady and tireless. Across the ocean, the war raged on. German bombers still darkened the skies over Europe, and London still burned in the night. But far from the front on the quiet plains of Michigan, a new kind of power had taken root. It did not march or shout, it did not need medals or parades it built. From that cold earth, the flying factory had risen. Every new sunrise saw another liberator roll towards the runway, its engines shaking the frost from the ground. The farmland that once grew wheat was now growing wings. What began as soil and silence now sent thunder into the sky. And the world was beginning to understand that America's greatest weapon was not the machine itself, but the will to build it again and again until the sky was full. In rooms filled with drafting smoke and blueprints, engineers battled time. They faced the same enemy as the pilots would, physics itself. Each rivet, each hydraulic line, had to survive freezing altitudes, gunfire, and vibration. Mistakes meant death. The stress of perfection became their daily mission. The walls of the engineering offices at Willow Run were lined with drawings that stretched from floor to ceiling. Every line on those blue sheets represented a problem that had to be solved before a bomber could fly. The air smelled of graphite, coffee, and fatigue. Men worked through the night with rulers, slide rules, and compasses, calculating stresses that no classroom had ever prepared them for. What they built on paper would soon be tested in sky and fire. To the engineers, the war was not fought with guns, but with numbers. The bomber was both masterpiece and monster, a creation that demanded absolute obedience to the laws of nature. Aluminum could bend only so far before it cracked. Oil lines froze at altitude. Turbochargers failed if their bearings wore unevenly. Every hour brought a new equation. Every error, another potential tragedy. They carried that knowledge like a weight. When a bomber was lost in combat, the first question was not only who had died, but what had failed. There was no glamour in their work, only endurance. The rooms were lit by desk lamps that cast long shadows over the tables. Draftsmen drew until their fingers cramped. Engineers argued in quiet, clipped voices, debating fractions of inches that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. They were men who spoke in tolerances, who measured their pride in decimal points. Yet, behind all the precision was something more human, a quiet fear that they might miss something, a single flaw that would cost lives. Testing never stopped. Engines were run until they shook themselves apart. Wing panels were bent under pressure until they screamed. Propellers were spun until the air around them shimmered with heat. When something broke, the engineers studied the wreckage as doctors studied wounded men. Failure was not shame, it was information. The war demanded that they learn faster than the enemy could adapt. The new bomber had to be strong enough to survive flak and enemy fire, yet light enough to carry its load across an ocean. It had to climb higher, way farther, and return home after hours of punishment. The answers came not from inspiration, but from discipline. Dozens of modifications passed through the drafting tables each week. Some were barely visible. A line moved slightly, a joint reinforced, a cable rerouted. Each one made the aircraft a little safer, a little stronger, a little more certain to bring its crew home alive. Henry Ford's philosophy guided their work. He did not want miracles. He wanted methods. He believed that the engineer's task was not to invent perfection, but to make perfection repeatable. If it cannot be built by the thousands, he said, it does not matter that it flies once. Those words became the creed of the drafting rooms. The goal was not to create a single flawless bomber, but to design one that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and trusted completely. For the engineers, this was their front line. They fought an invisible war measured in equations and blueprints instead of distance and fire. Each drawing was a battlefield of its own. They fought fatigue, doubt, and the knowledge that one forgotten detail could bring death to men they would never meet. Their courage was quiet, their victories anonymous. Outside, the roar of the factory filled the air day and night. But inside the design rooms, the sound was softer, steady, and deliberate. The scratch of pencil on vellum, the rustle of paper as another design passed across a desk, the faint hum of electric lamps burning long after midnight. This was how a nation built its wings. When the first damaged bombers returned from combat and landed in England with holes torn through their fuselages, engineers studied every inch. They touched the jagged metal, read the patterns of survival, and saw proof that their work had held. The planes had come back because of choices made in these quiet rooms thousands of miles away. By the spring of 1943, the engineering offices had become as vital to the war effort as any battlefield. Every improvement drawn in Michigan meant more crews returning from the skies over Europe. The men who worked there would never see combat, but they felt every mission. They understood that behind every flight plan was a blueprint, and behind every blueprint was a man with a pencil who refused to let the laws of physics decide who lived and who did not. They called it the Engineers' War, a battle fought with thought instead of fire, with patience instead of pride. And though they wore no uniforms and carried no medals, their signatures were written in the wings that filled the sky. Each calculation was an act of defiance against gravity, each line of ink a promise that the machines they built would fly true. When the bombers thundered above Europe, engines shaking the air, their strength carried the unseen fingerprints of these men. The engineers never fired a shot, yet their quiet war shaped every victory that followed. In 1943, German radio broadcast a segment titled American Toys. It mocked reports of female mechanics and assembly line bombers. Luftwaffe officers scoffed. You cannot mass-produce courage. But courage was exactly what America was producing, in quantities that defied imagination. The broadcast aired on a gray winter evening in Berlin. Cafes were still crowded, the theaters still open, and faith in German superiority remained unbroken. The announcer's voice, calm and certain, carried across the airwaves with a tone of ridicule. He described the factories of Detroit and the women who worked there as a spectacle, a nation of amateurs pretending to build weapons of war. In the studio, laughter rose easily. To them, the idea that women and factory workers could build machines to challenge the Reich was absurd. But while they laughed, the truth was already moving across the world. In the American Midwest, the factories did not sleep. Steam rose from the roofs of enormous plants that stretched farther than the eye could see. Sparks from welding torches lit the night like fireflies. Conveyor belts turned endlessly, carrying wings, engines, and fuselages forward. Every hour, a new bomber rolled into the light. Germany believed mastery came from the craftsman's touch, from precision born of discipline and pride. They built their fighters by hand, one at a time, slow and exact. To them, the American belief in mass production seemed childish, even dangerous. How could quality come from speed? How could courage be built by strangers on an assembly line? But America was not chasing perfection. It was building power. The workers at Willow Run and other plants did not care for elegance or style. They cared for results. Women in bandanas and men in oil-stained gloves stood side by side, tightening bolts, sealing fuel lines, and testing engines. Each motion mattered. Each mistake cost time, and time was the only thing they could not afford to lose. When the first B-24 bombers appeared over Europe, the laughter stopped. German pilots who had once mocked the American factories now faced swarms of aircraft that stretched from horizon to horizon. The silver shapes filled the sky, steady and unrelenting. Each one carried the strength of thousands of unseen hands. The Luftwaffe scrambled to meet them, but every victory was hollow. For each bomber that fell, 10 more arrived. Reports from the front reached Berlin with growing urgency. Commanders wrote of endless formations, of bombers that seemed to appear faster than they could be destroyed. One veteran pilot admitted that it felt like trying to fight a tide that never receded. The Reich's leaders dismissed the reports as exaggeration, but fear began to creep into every conversation. Inside Germany, the propaganda continued. The radio host spoke of American waste, of planes that would fall apart under stress, of soldiers too soft to fight. But the cities below those very broadcasts soon trembled under the engines of the machines they had mocked. The skies that once belonged to the Reich were now filled with the steady thunder of American industry. At Willow Run, workers heard about the broadcasts. Some read the transcripts printed in newspapers and smiled. They did not respond with words. Their answer was work. Each rivet they set, each wing they raised, was a quiet act of defiance. The laughter of the enemy had become fuel for their resolve. By the end of 1943, German pilots spoke of the bombers with a mixture of awe and dread. The planes were not elegant, but they were endless. They kept coming, wave after wave, day after day. What the Germans had called toys had become the instruments of their undoing. In Berlin, the tone of the radio changed. Gone were the jokes and the laughter. In their place came silence, then forced optimism, then finally despair. The announcers who once mocked America now spoke of sacrifice and fate. The confidence that had carried a nation into war was breaking beneath the weight of a single truth. You cannot mass-produce arrogance, but you can mass-produce strength, precision, and courage. And America had done exactly that. By the time the bombers reached Berlin itself, the irony was complete. The very people who had laughed now hid beneath the sound of their own disbelief. The sky belonged to those who had been mocked, to the workers who had built their courage with their hands. The laughter that once filled the airwaves had vanished, replaced by the endless hum of engines. The voices that had called the bombers toys now spoke only in whispers, drowned by the roar of what America had created, an army of machines born from steel, sweat, and the quiet determination of people who refused to be underestimated. March 1st, 1943. A test pilot named Clay Pennington took the controls of a freshly assembled B-24 straight from the line. The aircraft climbed smoothly into a gray Michigan sky, the engines harmonizing like organs in a cathedral. When he landed, his report was 3 words long: "She flies beautifully." The men on the ground stood silent as the bomber lifted from the runway. For months, they had watched machines rise and vanish into the clouds, but this one felt different. It was not just another test. It was proof. The cold air shimmered around the exhaust as the 4 engines roared to life, and the silver body of the aircraft cut through the low ceiling like a blade through fog. Inside the cockpit, Pennington gripped the yoke, feeling the weight of thousands of unseen hands that had built what he was flying. The B-24 was not a gentle machine. It was raw, demanding, and full of power. It vibrated with life, the controls heavy under pressure, the fuselage trembling with every gust. But this one felt right. It climbed without hesitation, the instruments steady, the balance true. Pennington eased it into a turn over the snow-dusted fields of Michigan, the wings glinting pale silver against the clouds. The noise in the cockpit was deafening, but to him it was music. Every test flight at Willow Run carried risk. These were not ceremonial missions. They were the final step in a chain of creation that began in sweat and ended in the sky. Pennington knew that each time he took off, he was flying a machine built by people who had never seen it soar. Every rivet, every bolt, every panel mattered. If one failed, so would he. Yet there was a strange trust between pilot and a faith that what had been built by thousands of hands could hold together against the wind. Below him, the vast outline of the factory stretched for miles. It was a living organism, pulsing with motion and light. Trains arrived with supplies. Trucks carried crates to the loading bays, and inside another bomber was already halfway to completion. From above, Willow Run looked like a city built entirely for one purpose: to give wings to steel. Pennington turned the bomber west and leveled off at 10,000 feet. The air smoothed out, the engines hummed evenly, and for a moment he let himself relax. He reached down and noted the readings. Oil pressure stable, temperature normal, no vibration in the propellers. It was a perfect run. In that instant, he realized what the numbers meant: not just a successful flight, but the beginning of something larger. If this bomber could be built perfectly here, it could be built perfectly anywhere, again and again. When he landed, the ground crew gathered around as the engine slowed to a soft rumble. The bomber rolled to a stop, its tires hissing on the frozen tarmac. Pennington opened the hatch, climbed down the ladder, and handed his clipboard to the supervisor. His flight log contained only 3 words: "She flies beautifully." Those words moved through the plant like a spark. They reached the engineers who had worried over the aircraft's balance, the workers who had spent nights tightening bolts, and the women who had sealed the panels with aching hands. It was not just a report. It was vindication. The machine worked. The dream held together. Word of Pennington's flight spread quickly through the ranks of the Army Air Forces. Inspectors who had once doubted Ford's methods now took notes from his success. Military officers arrived to see the plant in operation, watching as bombers rolled from the line in near perfect succession. Each one bore the quiet assurance of Pennington's verdict. They all flew beautifully. In the months that followed, test pilots like Pennington became the final link in the chain of trust between the factory and the front. They risked their lives to ensure that what rolled out of Michigan could survive in the skies above Europe. Every flight was a message to the workers, to the generals, to the enemy. The machines were sound. The process was working. Pennington continued to fly, testing new aircraft almost daily. Some flights were rough, some terrifying. Engines would fail, controls would jam, and once a landing gear collapsed beneath him. But each time he climbed out, brushed off the dust, and returned to the line. He trusted the process. He trusted the people. By the end of 1943, thousands of B-24s had taken to the air, each one carrying the same lineage of craftsmanship, calculation, and courage. From that first flight onward, every new bomber carried within it a fragment of Pennington's words. They became more than a verdict, they became a promise. She flies beautifully. It was a simple statement, but behind it lay everything the factory stood for. It was the voice of faith in machinery, in teamwork, in the possibility that order and precision could win a war. For the men and women of Willow Run, those 3 words were enough. They had built something that not only flew, but soared. And in the sky above Michigan, as the next bomber lifted from the runway, that promise continued steady, powerful, and alive. The Willow Run complex ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From the air, it looked like a shining circuit, windows glowing against the dark countryside. Inside, 3 shifts rotated endlessly, the clang of metal never stopping. America was no longer at war overseas. It was at war here, in the factories. From dusk until dawn, the ground trembled. The sound of hammering, riveting, and engines testing filled the air like the heartbeat of a nation. Freight trains arrived in constant rhythm, carrying aluminum, rubber, and fuel. The smell of oil and metal hung heavy over the fields of Michigan. Where there had once been silence and snow, there was now motion, heat, and light. The front line was no longer measured in miles of trenches or skies full of planes. It was measured in assembly lines, in shifts, in output. Inside, the factory floor was a world unto itself. Thousands of workers moved in a choreographed storm of movement. Sparks rained from welding torches. Cranes swung above the rows of machinery. The sound was relentless, a roar that blurred the boundary between machine and human. It was not chaos. It was rhythm. Each clang and hum carried purpose. Each echo marked another step toward victory. Supervisors walked the floor with clipboards and stopwatches, counting seconds, watching for delays. Every process had been calculated, timed, and improved. If a conveyor belt slowed, it was repaired within minutes. If a worker fell ill, another stepped into their place. There was no pause, no silence. The people of Willow Run worked with the urgency of soldiers in battle. For them, the enemy was not across an ocean. The enemy was time. The war had transformed American industry into something the world had never seen before. Factories that once made cars, stoves, and farm equipment were now building engines, guns, and aircraft. In California, shipyards launched vessels faster than the Navy could crew them. In Pittsburgh, furnaces poured steel day and night. In Michigan, the sky glowed faintly red from the reflection of molten metal. It was not only the soldiers who fought. The nation itself had become a machine of war. At Willow Run, 3 shifts kept the lines alive without rest. The day shift began at sunrise, faces tired but steady. The afternoon shift arrived before the first left, overlapping in a seamless transfer of labor. By midnight, the night workers stepped in, eyes weary, hands still slick with oil. When one shift slept, another worked. When one line stopped, another began. The rhythm never broke. The machinery of democracy had found its perfect tempo. Outside the plant, entire towns revolved around its schedule. Cafes opened at strange hours to serve meals between shifts. Bus routes ran through the night, bringing workers from miles away. Boarding houses filled with strangers who shared rooms but never met, passing one another between dawn and dusk. The war blurred the boundaries between day and night, work and rest. Time itself became part of the battle. Not everyone inside the factory carried a weapon, but everyone carried responsibility. A missed bolt, a misaligned panel, a faulty circuit. Any one of these could doom a bomber and its crew. The workers knew it. They checked, measured, and checked again. Some prayed quietly at their stations. Others whispered to themselves, counting each turn of a wrench as if it were a heartbeat. When visitors toured Willow Run, they often fell silent. They expected noise, but not the kind they found. It was not chaos, it was order. It was the sound of determination made physical. Reporters described the plant as an army without uniforms, marching to the rhythm of machinery. Each worker was a soldier, and every completed bomber was a weapon built from patience, sweat, and repetition. Across the ocean, German intelligence tried to understand how such production was possible. Reports of American factories working day and night sounded like fantasy. They could not grasp the scale, the millions of people, the endless supply lines, the devotion to process. They had not yet realized that America's true weapon was not a single machine, but the system that built them all. By 1944, the results were visible from the sky. Allied bombers filled the air, their numbers so vast that the sun glinted off their wings like water. The factories that produced them had become the lifeblood of the war effort. Every B-24 that lifted from the runway carried within it the echo of those who had built it. The welders, the machinists, the foremen, the women who drove rivets into its frame. The battlefields of Europe were far away, but the outcome was decided here, amid the roar of machines and the glow of furnace light. This was where the war was truly won, not only through courage in the air, but through endurance on the ground. When people spoke of victory, they imagined flags and parades. But victory had been born here, in the sleepless halls of Willow Run, where the fight never stopped, and the rhythm of war was measured not in gunfire, but in production. By late 1943, Ford-built B-24s filled the skies over England. Parked wingtip to wingtip on muddy airfields, they carried names painted by their crews: Liberty Bell, Dixie Clipper, Ford's Folly. German intelligence began noticing something unsettling. Every time they destroyed a formation, new ones appeared the next week. Across East Anglia, the flat English countryside had become an ocean of aircraft. The mornings began with fog and the low rumble of engines warming in the cold. The ground crews moved between rows of bombers, wiping frost from windshields and checking the tires sunk in mud. The air was heavy with fuel and oil, the scent of war in its purest form. From a distance, it looked like a city of wings, stretching from horizon to horizon, a monument to American industry that had crossed an ocean. The men who flew them were young. Most were barely in their 20s, trained in a matter of months, and hardened by the weight of what they carried. They lived in barracks of wood and tin, surrounded by mud, letters from home, and the constant thrum of aircraft engines. In the dim light of morning, they gathered in briefing rooms under flickering lamps. Maps covered the walls, crisscrossed with string and red pins marking their next target. Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, Berlin. They knew the risks. Each briefing ended with the same quiet thought: not everyone who took off would return. But now, something had shifted. The number of aircraft had become overwhelming. The formations that once counted dozens now filled the sky by the hundreds. Every week, new bombers arrived from America, freshly painted, gleaming silver, their wings still clean of soot and flak scars. They were born in the furnace light of Michigan and rolled straight into the gray skies of England. The rhythm of creation had become a kind of defiance. To the Germans, it was an impossible sight. Pilots looked up from the fields of occupied France and saw the sky darken with silver. They dove into the formations and found that for every bomber they shot down, another seemed to rise behind it. German commanders began to report that the enemy had become uncountable. The intelligence officers in Berlin received the same message again and again. The Americans have no limit. Every bomber bore a story. The names painted on their noses were tokens of hope and defiance. Some were named for sweethearts, some for small towns in Kansas or Ohio, others for the absurd humor of youth. Painted letters curved across olive-drab metal. My darling, homeward bound, misbehavin', and sometimes simply freedom. The men who flew them trusted those machines completely. They had seen what they could endure. They knew how many hands had built them, how many hearts had believed in them. Each morning, the ground shook as the bombers lifted off in waves. The sky filled with their sound, deep, steady, and endless. The noise was not just the noise of engines. It was the sound of a nation arriving. From the air, formations looked like rivers of steel flowing east toward the enemy. The clouds swallowed them, then released them again, each wave larger than the last. The Germans could not believe what they were seeing. Reconnaissance photographs showed airfields in England packed with aircraft, thousands lined in perfect order. The reports that reached Berlin were read in silence. They spoke of factories in America that worked through the night, of workers who did not rest, of new aircraft arriving faster than they could be destroyed. The war of production had become as decisive as any battle. In the mess halls of English bases, the pilots spoke quietly about it. They could feel the weight of that machine behind them, the endless trains, the smokestacks, the factories glowing through the dark. When one of their bombers was lost, another took its place before the week was done. The system never stopped. The nation itself seemed to breathe through those engines. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe could no longer keep pace. The skies that had once belonged to them now belonged to the bombers. They filled the air over Europe with sound, with purpose, with inevitability. The German broadcasts that had once mocked the American factories fell silent. There was nothing left to mock. In the villages of England, people learned to live by the rhythm of those takeoffs. Children paused their play when the engines began to growl, looking up as the endless formations passed overhead. The rumble faded into the distance, carrying with it the promise that the war's outcome was no longer uncertain. From across the Atlantic came not just machines, but a message built from steel, courage, and persistence. Every bomber that rose from the muddy airfields of England carried that message across the Channel and into the heart of Germany. It said, without words, that America had entered the war not as a collection of soldiers, but as a force of creation. It said that courage could, indeed, be produced not in factories of fear, but in factories of faith. And as the bombers vanished into the gray distance, the sound they left behind was not only thunder, it was the echo of everything the enemy had underestimated. They were young, 19, 20, 21, men who had never seen Michigan but trusted the machines that came from it. For them, Willow Run was not a factory. It was a promise that someone back home believed they would return. Each rivet was a prayer held together by aluminum and faith. Across the airfields of England, the ground shook every morning as engines roared to life. The air smelled of fuel, mud, and frost. Pilots climbed into their bombers with hands still numb from the cold. Some carried photographs in their pockets, small tokens of what they were fighting for. Others stayed silent, looking straight ahead, waiting for the signal to move. When the flares went up, hundreds of aircraft began to roll down the runways one after another until the sky itself began to tremble. From above, it looked like order. From inside, it was chaos. The noise was deafening, the engines so loud that men could feel them in their bones. Each B-24 vibrated like a living thing, its metal skin quivering under strain. The crews spoke through gestures and shouted words that vanished into the wind. As they climbed through the clouds, the formation tightened, and the horizon filled with silver wings. The young men of America were now inside the machines that Michigan had built for them. They knew the odds. They had seen bombers return torn apart by shrapnel, landing gear twisted, engines shot out. They had watched empty seats appear in the mess hall after each mission. But still they climbed aboard, because that was what was expected. The courage they carried was not loud or reckless. It was quiet and disciplined, the kind that came from trust, in their crew, in their training, and in the aircraft that had been born from the endless labor of strangers they would never meet. In the briefing rooms before takeoff, they traced their routes over Europe with shaking fingers. Berlin, Munich, the Ruhr Valley, places they had only seen on maps. When the commanding officer spoke, no one asked questions. They simply nodded, folded their papers, and went to their planes. Outside, the ground crews waited, giving silent gestures of support as each bomber rolled past. The men in the cockpit would never see them again, but those brief moments of connection were everything. It was the link between the builders and the pilots, between the factory and the front. In the air, the missions felt endless. Hours of steady flight through cold so deep it burned the lungs. Frost crept along the inside of the windows. The gunners sat behind their weapons, scanning the empty blue for the sudden flash of an enemy fighter. The bombardier watched his instruments, calculating angles and distance while flak exploded in black clouds all around them. Every sound mattered. Every vibration could mean life or death. Yet, through all of it, there was faith, not just in God, but in the machine. They had been told these bombers were strong, and the bombers proved it. Even when engines failed, when wings were shredded, when holes big enough to crawl through opened in the fuselage, the Liberators somehow kept flying. They brought their crews home again and again, carried by the strength of the hands that had built them. When a damaged bomber limped back to base, riddled with holes, it drew every eye on the airfield. Ground crews ran to meet it, counting the men as they climbed down. Sometimes all 10 stepped out, sometimes fewer. The ones who survived always touched the metal of the aircraft before walking away, a small gesture of gratitude. They knew the plane had taken the damage for them. It had done its job. Letters traveled back across the ocean to Michigan. Pilots wrote to the women who riveted the wings, to the men who built the engines. Some were published in newspapers. One message read simply that the plane brought me home. Another said, "Tell the girl who drilled the holes in the fuselage that she saved my life." Those words reached the factory floor, carried by foremen who read them aloud. The workers paused for a moment, listening in silence. Then they went back to work. For the pilots, Willow Run was not just a place. It was an idea. It was proof that someone was behind them, unseen but present, turning metal into hope. Every bomber that lifted from the ground was a message that they were not alone. By the end of 1944, many of those young men were gone. Some never returned, their planes vanishing into the clouds. But others came home, and when they did, they carried stories of the machines that had saved them, the ones that took flak and fire and still refused to fall. They never met the people who built their aircraft, but the connection between them endured. It was written in every flight, every mission, every return. The men who flew them and the people who built them were part of the same story, one of faith, courage, and the quiet belief that a machine built with care could carry a human heart through hell and bring it safely back again. The math of total war was merciless. The Luftwaffe's elite could down a dozen bombers in a day, but Ford could replace them before nightfall. German analysts realized they were facing not an air force, but an equation they could not solve: industrial output multiplied by endurance. War had always been measured in courage and skill, in tactics and chance. But by 1943, those measures had changed. The age of valor had been replaced by the age of volume. Every raid, every loss, every burst of flak became part of a greater arithmetic that would decide the fate of nations. The sky was no longer ruled by the best pilot, but by the side that could fill it fastest. In Berlin, reports from the front told a story that numbers could barely contain. The Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of aircraft in a single month. Fuel supplies were dwindling, and trained pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Every victory in the air now came with a cost that Germany could no longer afford. Each time a bomber fell, 2 more appeared within the week. The arithmetic was turning against them, and the German command knew it. Inside the planning rooms, analysts pored over graphs and supply charts. They calculated that American factories were producing 4 times as many aircraft as all of Germany combined. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was building a B-24 every hour. Across the United States, similar lines of production fed an endless stream of machines into the war effort. It was not just quantity, it was reliability. Every aircraft was nearly identical, built to fit, to fly, and to endure. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the change was felt in the air. The first time they faced the great American formations, they attacked with confidence, diving into the bombers with practiced precision. But after weeks of battle, confidence turned to dread. For every bomber destroyed, 10 more appeared on the horizon. The air grew thick with smoke and contrails, the sky filled with the relentless hum of engines. The enemy no longer fought like men. It fought like a machine. The German aces were still deadly. They tore through formations, their guns cutting trails through the air. But even the best could not alter the numbers. Every engagement was a losing equation. A dozen bombers might fall, but thousands waited to take their place. Ford's factories, and the factories that followed its example had transformed war from a contest of strength into a test of endurance. Back in Michigan, workers heard about the losses and redoubled their efforts. They understood that every rivet, every bolt, every turn of a wrench had meaning. Newsreels showed the bombers returning from missions with holes in their wings, engines missing, yet still flying. Those images became fuel for the factories. The workers were not just replacing machines, they were replacing hope. The American commanders understood the power of this new arithmetic. They planned missions, knowing that they could afford losses the enemy could not. It was not cruelty. It was inevitability. Every destroyed bomber was simply another number in a sequence that would continue until the enemy ran out of planes, out of fuel, and out of time. In Germany, desperation began to replace arrogance. Factories that once produced luxury cars now struggled to build fighters. Fuel shortages crippled training. Replacement pilots took to the air with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. The Luftwaffe's elite, once masters of the sky, were vanishing faster than their victories could matter. In contrast, the American war machine grew stronger with every month. The factories worked without pause, their windows glowing through the night. At Willow Run, the assembly lines never stopped. The sound of production was steady and merciless, an industrial drumbeat that echoed across the ocean. When one bomber fell, another rolled from the line before dawn. The rhythm of creation had become the rhythm of conquest. By early 1944, the mathematics of war had become a prophecy. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer win. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in a single battle or by a single weapon. It was defeated by the sum of every factory, every worker, every engineer who had turned production into power. In the end, the calculus of attrition was simple. For every plane that Germany lost, it could build one. For every plane that America lost, it could build 10. The balance could not hold. Numbers, cold and unforgiving, had become the deciding weapon of the war. The German analysts who had once laughed at American industry now stared at their reports in disbelief. They had discovered a new kind of enemy, the one that could not be outflown, outgunned, or outlasted. It was not just a fleet of machines that faced them. It was a nation that had learned to turn industry into endurance. The Luftwaffe still had courage, but courage alone could not solve the equation. February 24, 1944. Over Gotha, Germany, Ford built B-24s met the Luftwaffe head-on. Contrails crossed in spirals as cannon shells burst among the formations. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Dozens went down, but more kept coming. The German pilots began to realize what they were fighting was not bravery alone. It was production. The winter sky over central Germany was pale and thin, the kind of cold that made metal brittle and breath turn to frost inside a mask. At 20,000 feet, the air was knife-sharp, and the noise of the engines was a constant wall of sound. Inside the bombers, everything vibrated. The men were strapped into their positions, gloved hands gripping metal handles, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had trained for this moment, but nothing could prepare them for what waited ahead. Gotha was one of the heartbeats of German aviation. The factories there built the very aircraft that were now clawing into the sky to meet the American attack. This was not just another mission. It was a strike at the core of the enemy's ability to fight, and for the men in the Ford-built bombers, it was a trial by fire. The first wave of fighters appeared as dark specks against the sun. They came in fast, silent at first, then screaming as they closed the distance. The gunners shouted to one another through their intercoms, adjusting their turrets, waiting for the range to close. Then the world erupted. Tracers streaked through the air in red and white lines. Explosions flared among the bombers. A wing sheared off, spinning into the clouds. The men kept firing. Each burst of cannon fire from below felt like the air itself was being torn apart. The shock waves rattled the aircraft, shaking tools loose and cracking glass. Yet the formation held. The B-24s flew straight into the storm, engines roaring in defiance. One by one, they reached their release points, the bomb bay doors opening in unison. The payloads dropped in a single motion, a rain of steel that vanished into the clouds below. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. The bombers kept coming. Each time a formation broke apart, another appeared behind it. For every aircraft that fell, 2 more filled the sky. The Luftwaffe pilots were among the best in the world, but skill meant little against the relentless arithmetic of American industry. They could not outfight what could not be exhausted. Inside the bombers, the crews fought against fear and physics. The cold bit through their flight suits. The guns froze, jammed, and were cleared again. The oxygen masks iced over. The radio crackled with half-heard voices, calls for help, coordinates, prayers. A tail gunner shouted as a burst of rounds tore through his turret, glass shattering around him. He stayed at his post. They all did. One bomber took a direct hit to its right wing. The pilot struggled to keep control, fighting the spin. Smoke filled the cockpit. Through the haze, he saw the bomber beside him still flying. The numbers were staggering. Ford's factories built over 8,000 B-24s. Each one required 200,000 rivets, 3 miles of wiring, and 600 gallons of aviation fuel for a single mission. The enemy could not comprehend how a nation could fight a war by building its way through it. By 1944, American industry had become something beyond the imagination of its enemies. What had once been a patchwork of automobile plants and shipyards had turned into the greatest manufacturing force in history. The lines that once produced engines for cars now gave birth to bombers, tanks, and trucks. The same engineers who once measured horsepower now measured firepower. The rhythm of industry had become the pulse of victory. At Willow Run, the assembly lines ran like veins of a living creature. Each section of the factory was a vital organ, each worker a cell within it. Thousands labored in unison, feeding the machine with energy, precision, and endurance. There was no single hero, no defining moment of triumph, only the steady accumulation of effort, measured in the planes that rolled out of the hangar doors every hour. Across the country, other factories joined in the effort. Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in San Diego, Douglas in Long Beach, North American in Inglewood. Together they built fleets that spanned oceans. They produced aircraft faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. What began as production became momentum, and what began as momentum became inevitability. Every statistic told the same story. American factories turned out over 90,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Every minute, another engine came to life. Every hour, another plane took flight. No other nation had ever waged war this way. Germany had fought through conquest. Japan through ambition. America fought through creation. This was not blind output. It was mastery. The machines that rolled from the factories were built with discipline and purpose. The rivets were counted, the wires measured, the systems tested until perfection was not an exception, but an expectation. Each B-24 that lifted into the sky carried within it the spirit of a country that had learned to transform imagination into endurance. To the Germans, it seemed impossible. They watched from the ruins of their cities as wave after wave of bombers crossed the horizon. Every time they thought the onslaught had reached its peak, the next wave came, larger and stronger. They did not understand that the American advantage was not in any single machine, but in the ability to build them without end. It was a war of tempo, and America had found its rhythm. Inside the factories, the workers rarely saw the full scale of what they were part of. They measured progress in parts and shifts, in the small details of their craft. But when they saw photographs of entire airfields covered with B-24s, wings touching wings stretching into the distance, they began to understand. Their work had become something greater than themselves, a force that reshaped the very balance of power. The industrial tide moved beyond aircraft. For every bomber, there were the ships that carried fuel, the trucks that hauled supplies, the weapons that armed soldiers across continents. Each component was part of a vast, coordinated effort, a web of logistics that reached from Detroit to Dover, from the Mississippi to the Mediterranean. The line between factory and battlefield no longer existed. The engineers who designed the production systems understood this perfectly. They called it flow, a continuous cycle where nothing was wasted and everything was connected. A sheet of metal pressed in Michigan might become a wing spar in California, then a bomber over France. Each stage fed the next. It was not chaos, but harmony on an industrial scale. The factories did not just build machines, they built time. Every hour saved in production was an hour gained in battle. Every process improved was a life spared at the front. The workers understood this, even if they rarely said it aloud. They were fighting a war measured not in blood, but in efficiency. Foreign journalists who visited American plants wrote with astonishment. They described the scale, the precision, the calm certainty with which the workers labored. There was no desperation, no panic, only purpose. They called it a new kind of warfare, one waged by engineers and builders, fought with blueprints and tools. By the end of 1944, the results were undeniable. The skies over Europe and the Pacific belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe had crumbled, the Japanese air defenses were breaking, and the factories of America continued to roar. What began as a response to war had become a lesson in what human resolve could achieve when organized with discipline and vision. The industrial tide had done more than win battles. It had redefined the meaning of strength. Power was no longer the roar of a single engine or the courage of a single soldier. It was the combined heartbeat of millions, workers, engineers, and builders, who believed that victory could be assembled, one plane at a time. In the end, the enemy never understood it. They could measure bombs, count aircraft, and track missions, but they could not measure will. They could not grasp how a free nation, scattered across a continent, could unite its factories, its workers, and its spirit into one unstoppable force. The sound that filled the skies of 1944 was not just the noise of engines. It was the sound of an idea, the belief that creation itself could overcome destruction. The industrial tide had risen, and it would not fall until the war was over. Behind every hour of production were names: Eleanor, Ruth, Clarence, Joe. They worked until their hands bled, slept for a few hours, then returned. Many never saw the planes fly, but their fingerprints traveled across oceans, over flak bursts and firestorms. They built victory one part at a time. Every machine born from Willow Run and the factories like it carried more than steel and oil. It carried the weight of people, ordinary men and women bound by extraordinary purpose. On the surface, the numbers told a story of efficiency and engineering, but beneath those numbers was something quieter and infinitely more powerful: humanity. The workers were not soldiers, yet they carried the war within them. The headlines spoke of battles in the air, but for them, the fight was measured in fatigue, in repetition, in endurance. They woke before dawn, packed lunches in paper bags, and walked through the gates into a world of noise and motion. They did not speak much of victory or patriotism. They spoke of getting through another shift. Eleanor worked at a riveting station near the tail section. She had been a schoolteacher before the war. Her hands were small but steady, her eyes sharp enough to spot the smallest crack. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, checking her work twice, then a third time. She never saw a finished B-24 take flight, but she knew the line number of every section she helped build. In her mind, each one had a destination: England, France, Italy, and perhaps one would carry someone she loved safely home. Ruth, a welder from Ohio, wore gloves lined with burn marks. She never removed her wedding ring, though she kept it wrapped in tape so it would not catch the light. Her husband had gone missing over Europe 6 months earlier. She never received confirmation of his death, only silence. She worked longer hours than anyone else, taking extra shifts when others could not. When asked why, she said that somewhere someone's husband might still be alive because of a weld that held. Clarence had been a machinist before the war began. He trained others, young women, old farmers, teenagers who had never touched a tool before. He taught them how to measure by feel, how to listen to a drill's pitch to know when the bit had gone deep enough. He carried a small pocket notebook filled with equations and sketches. To others, it was math. To him, it was survival. And Joe, a boy of 19, worked in the engine testing area. The roar of the Liberators shook his chest every hour as the engines came alive. The sound was deafening, but to Joe, it was music. He knew that each engine that passed his station would soon roar across the sky over Europe. He would stand for a moment after every test, watching the exhaust drift upward, imagining where it would go. Each of them was a part of something vast and invisible. They never met the pilots whose lives depended on their precision. They never saw the faces of the crews who would trust the SIG, rivets, the welds, and the bolts they set in place. But their connection was real. It was carried in the vibration of engines, in the hum of propellers, in the unspoken link between creation and survival. The war had made engineers of dreamers, laborers of scholars, and soldiers of citizens. There were no uniforms here, only coveralls and gloves, but the discipline was the same. Orders came not from generals, but from foremen. Deadlines replaced commands. The mission was constant: build faster, build better, build to last. When the newspapers printed stories about the bombers that leveled German industry or the air crews that returned from impossible missions, the workers read every line. They looked for mentions of the planes they had helped make. Most of the time, there were none. The bombers were simply called Liberators, without serial numbers or origins. But the workers knew. Each one could trace a shape, a panel, a weld, and say quietly, "I helped make that." There was exhaustion, but there was also pride. The workers learned that the human spirit could adapt to anything, to heat, to noise, to endless hours. They learned to find beauty in the sound of a perfectly fitted part, in the gleam of aluminum polished for inspection. In their fatigue, they discovered something greater than comfort, purpose. The war ended for them not with parades, but with silence. When the last planes left the factory floor, the machines went still. The sound that had filled their lives for years faded away. For the first time, the workers could hear themselves breathe. Some wept. Some smiled. Some simply went home, their hands still stained with grease, unsure of what to do next. Historians would later call them the arsenal of democracy. But they were more than that. They were proof that courage could exist in quiet forms, in repetition, in patience, in care. They fought with focus instead of fury, with precision instead of violence. The human equation was never written in reports or production charts. It was written in the faces of those who built, in the calluses on their palms, in the sleepless eyes that stared down the ticking clock of war. The war was won not only by those who flew through fire, but by those who built the wings that carried them there. Every rivet, every weld, every hour, was a piece of themselves offered to history. And though they never saw the sky their work conquered, they were the reason it was won. Spring, 1945. Over a shattered Europe, the skies belonged to America. The same voices that once mocked Detroit's factories now whispered in disbelief. German officers studied photographs of assembly lines and understood they had not been fighting men. They had been fighting a system. The laughter that had once echoed through the halls of Berlin's propaganda offices had long since faded. The pride, the arrogance, the certainty of German superiority had evaporated under the weight of endless bombardment. The very skies that once carried the Luftwaffe's triumph now carried the steady thunder of American engines. They came from the west in endless formations, silver shapes glinting in the sunlight, each one a product of the assembly lines the Reich had dismissed as crude and chaotic. The German High Command had once believed that industrial might could never replace skill, that factories could never replace warriors. They were wrong. By the spring of 1945, they understood that America had created something larger than an army. It had created a rhythm, a machine that did not rest, that turned imagination into force, that transformed the ordinary into the unstoppable. From the ruins of Hamburg to the rubble of Cologne, survivors watched the bombers pass in perfect formation. Their engines vibrated through the air like a single heartbeat. There was no need for speed or surprise anymore. There was only certainty. Each plane was a promise that the end was near, and that no amount of courage or cunning could stop it. In Berlin, officers pored over reconnaissance photos of American production plants. They saw rows of women at rivet lines, men in coveralls guiding cranes over vast fuselages, engines stacked like loaves of bread waiting to be sent to war. They saw precision on a scale beyond comprehension. To them, it looked less like industry and more like destiny. The propaganda broadcasts had once mocked these same images. They had shown American workers fumbling with tools, claiming that mass production meant weakness, that quantity was a substitute for quality. But now, looking at the shattered remains of their own cities, the truth was impossible to deny. Those factories had not built weakness. They had built inevitability. German pilots who survived the last months of the war spoke later of the horror of seeing entire skies filled with bombers. They described the feeling of climbing toward them, outnumbered and outgunned, knowing they would not return. Even the most skilled aces found themselves powerless. Their engines sputtered from lack of fuel, their ammunition was rationed, their airfields cratered. Above them, the formations rolled on, endless and unbroken. The industrial war had outlasted the human one. The American system of production had turned war into mathematics, time, materials, labor, output. Every equation ended the same way. The bombers came. The bombs fell. The factories kept building. The cycle never broke. For those on the ground, the sound of approaching engines became the sound of inevitability. The air raid sirens barely mattered anymore. People no longer ran to the shelters. They simply looked upward, watching the distant glint of silver wings. Some prayed, some cursed, most just waited. In the end, the German officers who had laughed at America's supposed clumsiness saw their mistake written in smoke across the sky. They had underestimated not a nation, but a principle. The belief that work itself could be weaponized, that the sum of many hands could create something greater than fear. The American factories had not only built machines, they had built endurance. They had built the will to continue long after others had fallen silent. That will was forged in the noise of stamping presses, in the glare of welding torches, in the exhaustion of night shifts. It was not glorious, but it was unstoppable. When the bombers returned to base after each mission, they were already being replaced by new ones taking off to join the next wave. The production line had become a living organism, feeding the sky with steel wings and human faith. The men who had once dismissed this process as mechanical soon realized it was something closer to spiritual. As the war reached its final days, German cities lay in ruins, their railways twisted, their power plants silenced. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, existed only in fragments. Pilots sat idle, staring at runways they could no longer use. The fuel was gone. The planes were gone. And above them, the endless drone of American bombers continued. In those final weeks, there was no laughter, no music, no speeches. The illusion of control had vanished. What remained was the quiet understanding that they had lost not just a war, but an era, an age that believed in superiority of will over system, of valor over production. The modern world had arrived, and it was built in factories. In the wreckage of Berlin, among the collapsed walls and smoking ruins, a captured German officer was shown photographs of Willow Run. He stared at them for a long moment before saying, almost to himself, that no one could have fought against something like that. It was not a compliment, it was an epitaph. The end of laughter was not marked by surrender or celebration. It was marked by silence, the silence that follows when the noise of arrogance is drowned by the steady hum of creation. The war had shown that machines alone did not win battles. Systems did, and in 1945 no system in the world was stronger, faster, or more relentless than the one that had begun in the factories of America. The sky over Europe that spring was filled with reminders of that truth. Silver wings reflecting sunlight, stretching from horizon to horizon. The laughter that had once mocked those wings was gone forever, replaced by a single, humbling understanding. The age of production had conquered the age of pride, and from that moment on, the world would never fight the same way again. When the guns fell silent, Willow Run closed its doors. The presses stopped, the lights dimmed, and silence settled where thunder once lived. But what had been built there changed everything. Proof that mass production could shape destiny, that a factory could win a war. For years, Willow Run had been alive. Its floors had shaken with motion. Its walls had glowed under the light of molten steel. The sound of the stamping presses had once been the heartbeat of a nation at war. Now, for the first time, the air inside was still. The echo of engines faded into memory. Dust began to settle where men and women had once stood shoulder to shoulder, turning metal into miracles. Outside, the fields of Michigan stretched quiet and green. The runways that had launched bombers into history were empty, their concrete cracked by the spring thaw. The smell of oil still clung to the air, faint but lasting, like the scent of a storm after it had passed. Workers who had given years of their lives to the line packed their tools and went home. Many did not yet understand that they had been part of something that would outlive them all. When the war ended, America did not simply return to peace. It entered something new. The factories that had once built bombers now built cars, tractors, and washing machines. The men and women who had once measured rivets and angles now measured profit margins and production schedules. Yet, behind every post-war innovation, behind every gleaming machine, was a memory of what had been done at Willow Run. Henry Ford's experiment in speed and precision had become a monument to what the human mind could achieve when guided by necessity. The idea that a nation could build its way to victory had been proven beyond doubt. The war had not only been a triumph of courage, but of calculation, of planning, of scale. Willow Run had turned that theory into fact. Its legacy was more than industrial, it was emotional. It had shown that work could be a form of service, that ordinary hands could create extraordinary results. The workers who had spent long nights under fluorescent light did not see themselves as heroes. Yet the pilots who had flown through fire owed them their lives. Every plane that crossed the Atlantic carried not only bombs, but faith in the hands that had built it. When historians wrote about the war, they often spoke of generals, strategies, and battles. Few spoke of the factory floors, the women with welding torches, the men tightening bolts until their knuckles bled. Yet that was where the true turning point had been forged, in the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of welds, the hum of conveyor belts that never stopped. After the surrender, nations around the world studied the American model. They saw that power did not only come from armies, but from the discipline of production. They saw that industry itself could be a weapon, and that the spirit of a free people, organized and determined, could achieve more than any regime, built on control. The workers of Willow Run returned home to families who barely recognized them. They had been transformed not by combat, but by creation. The exhaustion in their faces was matched by a quiet pride. They had lived inside history without realizing it. Their labor had rewritten the meaning of warfare. Eleanor, who had once riveted panels near the tail section, went back to teaching but kept a single aluminum bolt on her desk as a reminder of what she had helped build. Ruth, who had welded fuselages while waiting for word of her husband, became an advocate for working women. Clarence opened a small repair shop, his hands still precise, his eyes still sharp. Joe, once the boy who tested engines, became an engineer, designing machines meant for peace. The sound of Willow Run never truly vanished. It lingered in the design of every airplane that followed, in the confidence of every worker who believed they could accomplish the impossible. It was in the hum of Detroit, the heartbeat of a nation that had learned what it meant to build not just for survival, but for purpose. In time, the factory itself began to decay. Rust spread where once there had been fire. But even as its walls crumbled, people still came to see it, to stand where the bombers had rolled out one after another, and to remember what those walls had meant. They did not see ruins. They saw proof. Proof that when united by necessity, a nation of individuals could move with the precision of a single machine. The war had ended, but the lesson remained. Willow Run had taught that progress was not born of conquest, but of creation. It had shown that the power of many, working together toward a single goal, could change the course of the world. The presses would never thunder again. The lights would never blaze through the night. But the legacy of steel and sweat endured. It lived in every modern factory, every innovation, every dream that began not with a weapon, but with a tool. In the silence that followed the war, America stood taller because of what had been built there. And though the walls of Willow Run grew cold, its story remained warm. A reminder that victory, in the end, is not only won by those who fight, but by those who build. Decades later, when veterans visited the old airfield, they said the same thing. Standing where the bombers once rolled out, they could still hear it, the echo of engines starting, the hum of humanity at full power. The sound of America learning that in war, laughter fades, but steel remembers. The runways were cracked and overgrown with weeds, but the shape of history was still there. The long curve of concrete where the B-24s once gathered before takeoff. The rusting hangars that had once glowed under white light. The faint outline of the massive assembly hall, a cathedral built for creation rather than worship. Even in silence, the air seemed to hold its breath, as if listening for a sound that had never really gone away. Some of the veterans who returned had flown those very planes. Others had built them. All shared a quiet recognition of what had been done there. They spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of the machines that had once thundered to life. For them, Willow Run was not just a place on a map. It was a memory made solid, a reminder that strength could be built, shaped, and forged through will alone. When they closed their eyes, they could hear it again. The rhythm of presses striking metal, the clatter of tools hitting the floor, the calls of foremen echoing through the hangar, and beneath it all, the deep, steady pulse of engines coming alive, one after another until the air itself trembled with power. It was the sound of a nation waking up to its own potential. Those who had once laughed at the idea that factories could fight a war were long gone. The propaganda that had mocked American workers now lay buried beneath the ashes of the Reich. What remained was the truth, that courage can take many forms, and that sometimes it is found not in the trenches, but on the factory floor. For those who had lived through it, the memory of that sound was more than nostalgia. It was proof that ordinary people, when united in purpose, could create something greater than fear. The sound was not just the roar of engines, it was the sound of belief made real. As decades passed, Willow Run became a relic. Its vast assembly hall fell silent, its walls weathered by wind and rain. But the spirit of the place lived on in every airport, every factory, every hum of machinery that pushed civilization forward. The methods perfected there became the language of modern industry. The lesson it taught, that determination could be organized and creativity could be disciplined, became the foundation of a new world. For the veterans who returned, that lesson still carried weight. Some brought their grandchildren, guiding them through the ruins and pointing out where the lines had once moved, where the wings had been attached, where the first plane had taken off. To the young, it was hard to imagine. To the old, it felt as if it had happened yesterday. A few stood in silence, hats in hand, eyes closed against the wind. They did not speak. They did not need to. The sound that once filled these fields was gone from the air, but it remained inside them. It was in the heartbeat that quickened when they remembered the roar. It was in the way their hands still curled unconsciously as if holding a tool, guiding a rivet, turning a bolt. In time, the site became a museum. Children walked through displays of engines and blueprints, their shoes clicking on the same floor once trodden by the workers of war. Recordings played faintly in the background, the voices of those who had been there, describing what it felt like to see an entire bomber roll out every hour. Visitors listened, wide-eyed, as the sound of the past filled the room once more. It was not just a story about war, but about transformation. It told how a nation discovered that strength was not measured by armies, but by unity, that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was steady, patient, repetitive, the courage of hands that never stopped working, even when the night seemed endless. The veterans who stood at the edge of the airfield knew that the sound had outlasted them. It had become part of the country itself, an invisible current running through every workshop, every engine, every act of endurance. The sound that endured was not only that of metal and machinery. It was the sound of faith, of purpose, of a people who had learned that laughter fades, but effort endures. The echo of those engines had become the echo of a generation that refused to yield. And as the sun dipped behind the rusted hangars, the wind moved softly through the grass, carrying with it something faint but unmistakable. The hum of memory, the whisper of motion, the ghost of a sound that had once shaken the earth. It was the sound of America, still alive in the silence, the sound of steel remembering,